We're going to be in your notebook this week on page 28, which is part 3 of this course. And this is where we're going to look at, so we've kind of done an overview of the Old Testament. We've done an overview of the Bible and then an overview of the Old Testament and last week. So now we're going to talk about putting it together. How do you specifically interpret the Old Testament? In teaching the Old Testament in particular, one thing that I've found is many people, not even Christians, I mean, just in general, people have a hazy, somewhat informed notion of certain things in the Old Testament, but it's almost never based on actually studying those passages in the Old Testament. So example, David and Goliath. A lot of people think they know the story of David and Goliath. When you ask them, where do you know it from, most people know it from retellings that they've heard over the years. And among Christians, it'll usually come from like a children's Bible or a Sunday school lesson or an illustrated version or maybe a sermon sometimes. And so what happens is people kind of know these figures, these characters over the years, and it just basically conglomerates in our memory and gets passed on, and it's kind of like Bible through osmosis. Like you just grow up, especially if you grow up in a Christian home or going to church, you grow up and these stories are kind of all just in your brain, and you know they're in the Bible, but that's usually the extent of it. So you don't know, for instance, the difference in time between Moses and Noah, or you may confuse Abraham and Samuel, not realizing that those two are centuries, almost 1,000 years apart from each other in time and in setting. So it's helpful to get that big overview that we looked at last week of the Old Testament, to have this in your mind as you're reading and as you're interpreting any passage in the Hebrew Bible. Because this is like the clothesline that you hang the different garments on. You come to a passage, you can find it somewhere in this, and then that lets you understand better where it's coming from, what it's teaching, who it's talking to, and how we interpret it today. Well, so a lot of times what do we do about this flannel board mentality is what I call it. And when I say flannel board, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Or a few people that are old enough to remember or were raised in church. Flannel graphs were before PowerPoint, before iPads, before any of that stuff. Sunday school teachers used flannel graphs, and it was literally a big piece of flannel and then cut out pieces of flannel with Bible characters. So you could put Jesus, and then you could put the donkey, and then you could put the inn, and then the stone, and then you could roll it away. It was like a paper doll dress-up type thing. It was a flannel board. And that's how stories in Sunday school for multiple generations were told. We've gotten a little more tech savvy lately, and now you've got VeggieTales and things like that. But before that, that's how most people heard their Bible stories, was through things like flannel boards or coloring books. Well, what happens is if that's the only time you're ever exposed to these stories, then they become fables. You know, I know of fables like Aesop's fables. So fables are just stories that are self-contained, and they're there to teach a moral lesson. That's what fables are. And it's really popular and common for Christians, and even like some children's Bibles, to take stories out of the overall story of Scripture and make them as individual fables. So David and Goliath becomes about how you need to be a brave little boy or girl and stand up to the Goliaths in your life. Right? Jonah and the whale becomes how even when you're in the darkest of circumstances, you can trust God that He can bring you up out of them. These things become fables. They become little object lessons. The problem is that undermines pretty much the entire reason God gave them in the format that He did. He didn't give us fables. He didn't give us little moral lessons that are exemplified by characters' lives. We mentioned it last week. Jonah's a great example. Jonah's the bad guy in Jonah. He's the bad guy. You're not supposed to look to him for a moral lesson. Same thing with Jacob for most of Genesis. Jacob's the bad guy. A lot of these characters that we find, David's pretty bad at points in his life. These are things that we need to keep in mind when we look at these Old Testament passages. So we'll talk more about those in the week after next, especially. We'll look at least one example of David and Goliath and how sometimes we miss things because of our fable version. But another instance that happens in particular is with Genesis and with the creation account. Basically, all of the Genesis preface, chapters 1 through 11, is, like we've talked about before, it's like massive epic of world history crammed into 11 chapters. That's whole purpose is just to get you from creation to flood and to recreation and then to Abraham. That's the purpose of Genesis 1 through 11. To introduce the idea that creation went astray, sin and death entered the picture, the nations became separated from God. That's what Genesis 1 through 11 is teaching. But not knowing that, not having that big idea understanding sometimes, we just pick up Genesis and start reading, or read it to kids or to our children or in Sunday school or whatever, and we read the creation account, and we just kind of jump right into all the questions that we have. This section, Section 1 on page 28 is named after that tendency. What about the dinosaurs? That's the question that every kid asks at some point. If they read the Bible, at some point, every person asks, so what about the dinosaurs? Why do they ask that question? Well, one, dinosaurs are awesome. Like, everybody loves learning about dinosaurs when you're a kid. I've never seen a kid that doesn't think Tyrannosaurus Rexes are cool. Like, it's just dinosaurs are part of the imaginative world landscape. There's a purple talking stuffed dinosaur that ruled most of my middle school years. Not my middle, I was older than that, but the generation coming right up behind me was raised by a talking dinosaur that really annoyed the parents. And, dinosaurs are everywhere. And so they're such a part of our cultural consciousness and imagination. When you get to the Bible, that's a question that people rightly ask. Where are the dinosaurs in Genesis? And so some, interpreters, or maybe there's some curriculum out there you've seen where they'll kind of try to come at it from a certain perspective and talk about things like, well, the dinosaurs were on the ark with Noah, and they walked with humanity, and people rode on them and things. And then you get other interpretations that say, no, the dinosaurs aren't in Scripture because Scripture is a metaphor, and people didn't realize or know those scientific things back then, and we're smarter today and we know better, etc. But in looking at this section, we're going to look at Genesis 1, and I want you to know that question, what about the dinosaurs? That's a great question that kids and adults have, but it's one of those questions that you have to put on hold. There are questions that you have to put on hold for a while before you get back to them. What about the dinosaurs is basically another way of saying, what does this passage mean to me? It's basically saying, I have something I want to know about in my life. So for a little kid, it's dinosaurs, because kids love dinosaurs. For an adult, it may be which job to take or who to marry or whatever. I want to know something for my life, and I want to ask the Bible, and I want the Bible to tell me. And that's kind of what this is about. And so before you can ever answer those type of questions, what does it mean to me? What's the question you should ask? Does anybody remember from last week? Yes, what did it mean to them? Before you ever ask, what does a passage mean to me? The question that should be asked is, what did it mean to them? And so as we look at Genesis 1, and this is where I want you to take a Bible that you brought, hopefully, open it up, and what I want us to do is walk through Genesis 1 for the first half of tonight. And I'm going to do basically what I do at the weekly Bible study that I lead, the Ruth Chris study. I'm just going to kind of guide us and walk us through the passage and point out things that you may not know or that may not be clear in your English translation. Because remember, this was written in Hebrew, part of the Hebrew Bible, the first part of the book of Genesis. And so before we do that, there's some background that we have to know. For instance, this whole section is going to be dominated, it's going to be built around the concept of a day. So day, here's the Hebrew word, day. Here's your Hebrew lesson for tonight. The word is yom. Yom. So you ever have Jewish friends and they talk about Yom Kippur, we're celebrating Yom Kippur? That is Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So yom is the Hebrew word for day. And it's used all throughout this chapter, as you'll see. But the problem is that right from the beginning, this word yom has multiple meanings. There are about 4 or 5 ways that yom is used. The first time we ever see it in Scripture, which we're going to see in a minute, it means daylight, daytime, what we would say, like sun up to sundown. That's yom. But it also means day, like a full day, like a 24-hour day. That's also a yom. It can mean an extent of time, just like we say, back in the day, you should have seen how good I was on the court. Well, back in the day, there's not one day I'm talking about my basketball skills. I mean back during that time, right? Or, when we say it was in the day of such and such, king of so-and-so, whatever, we don't mean the one day. We mean the general extent of time. And it has that meaning elsewhere in Scripture. And it can also mean when. The way you say when in Hebrew, if you want to say when such and such happened, you would say in the day of such and such is happening. That's how you'd say when. And English translations frequently will just translate it as when. They actually do that in Genesis chapter 2, I believe verse 4 or 5. They translate in the day of God's creating of the heaven and earth. They translate it as when God created the heavens and the earth. So that's another meaning. And then lastly, very rarely, but on at least 2 occasions, yom is a word for, it means wind or storm. And that's a very rare use of the word, but it does mean that in certain prophetic and poetic passages. So automatically, before we start reading Genesis and trying to ask what about the dinosaurs and which day did God create and how old the earth is and all those questions that we just want to jump to, we have to pause and realize, okay, from the outset, these words that we're reading have meaning within their context. And that meaning is not a simple, well, a day's a day and that settles it. That does not settle it. That's a tautology. A day is a day. Yeah, but what is a day? In Scripture, what is a day? That's the question that we ask. And the reason I highlight that up front is because it plays such a prominent part in this section of Genesis. Also, there are stock phrases that we need to keep in mind. In normal, Hebrew uses idioms, it uses figures of speech, it uses just phrases that have certain meanings that may not have that same meaning in English. For instance, heavens and earth. That's what's called a merism. So like a merism is 2 extremes of something you say, but you really mean everything. So if I'm like, anybody can everybody has value from the cradle to the grave. What do I mean? Am I talking about literal cradles and literal graves? No, that's a way of saying every person in every stage of their existence. Jesus does it in the Bible, in Revelation. He says, I'm the Alpha and Omega. Well, Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter. So it's like saying, I am the A to Z. And it has that meaning of everything in between. Well, heavens and earth has that same meaning. The heavens, which is everything up there, and the earth, which is everything here. And that is a merism. That's a figure of speech that means everything in existence. Everything that's part of this created order is what that phrase heavens and earth means. So when God says, I summon the heavens and the earth to bear witness against you for such and such, that's what he's saying. I'm calling all of creation to bear witness to this covenant that I'm going to make or whatever prophetic word. And there's also, we see the phrase evening and morning. Through repetition. There's evening, there was morning. There was evening, there was morning. This is a repetitive thing that we see over and over. Because Genesis 1, more than anything else, the closest thing, it's its own genre. Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, is its own genre. Like there's nothing exactly like it in the ancient Near East literary world. It's somewhat like some of the epic poems that are in neighboring cultures, but it's also somewhat like some of the narratives. And it's also somewhat like some of the poems and the songs and the hymns. And the closest thing, so scholars wonder what to call Genesis 1, and one of the phrases I like that some have settled on is elevated prose or exalted prose, because it's not strictly a song, but it is lyrical. It's not strictly a hymn, but it is hymnic. It has refrains like evening and morning. God said such and such, and it was so. God saw that it was good. These are refrains that occur almost like verses in a song. So it is worshipful. It's not just detached scientific description. And that's a mistake that people make when they approach Genesis to begin with. No matter where you end up in your understanding of how Genesis and science fit together, you have to admit from the outset, if you're biblically astute, you have to admit it's not a modern scientific text. It's not trying to teach astrophysics or anthropology or geology. It's not. So once we have these kind of things in mind, then we can start to see it for what it is, And we can start to appreciate it on its own terms when we notice certain things about it. So we're going to slow down and walk through it. And it starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first verse, Genesis 1:1. Now that phrase, Bereshith, that first word, Bereshith bara Elohim, in the beginning, Bereshith, that is the one, that's the name of the book of Genesis in Hebrew, in the beginning. And it has this connotation of like, this is the start. This is the head. This is the source of everything that's about to come. So to ask, well, what was before the beginning, you're already stepping outside of what Scripture's going to teach. Because it doesn't, at least Genesis, doesn't address what was before the beginning. That's a question that would make no sense. It would be like asking, what's that bachelor's wife's name? It doesn't make any sense. By definition, bachelors don't have wives. So you can't ask what her name is because she doesn't exist categorically. So it's like that. In the beginning, it's just stating a stark reality. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's everything. In the beginning, God created it all. That's everything. Hebrew narrative will do this all the time. It'll give you a big picture event. Here's what happened. And then in the next section, it will jump back into a time frame within that event and unpack it in more detail. That's called recapitulation. It'll happen. It doesn't mean that there's two different accounts that were merged together. It doesn't mean different authors. It doesn't mean it. That's how it works. You see it all throughout the Hebrew Bible in various places. This event happened, and then the next chapter, now, these things happened, and it's talking about something that took place within that certain time. So that's what verse 2 does immediately, verse 2. Now, the earth was formless and empty, or formless and void, or however it's translated. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now we're starting to see some terms that have meaning in the ancient Near East. The surface of the deep and the abyss. That's what that literally, the deep is, the word is the abyss, to home. In the ancient world, the belief was that the gods went to war against the forces of chaos, and the gods conquered chaos, and through that battle created the world. So in Babylon, you had Tiamat slaying, or Marduk slaying Tiamat, the chaos dragon, and splitting her body in half, and one half becoming the sky and one half becoming the earth. And it was through that conflict that creation arose. These terms are terms that are loaded with meaning to the original reader. Same thing in Egyptian mythology. There's all kinds of the chaos serpent Set, and then the mighty hero, either Horus or Osiris, or these different figures who would fight against that chaos serpent to overcome and then to create and to bring forth. Well, in Genesis, Genesis begins kind of in that realm, at least in the minds of the hearers, saying, you want to know cosmology? You want to know ancient cosmology of how it was created? Let me tell you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the surface of the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. In other words, those would have resonated with readers from Babylon or Egypt, who were the first Hebrews hearing and circulating and sharing these stories. And so it uses these terms to talk about the earth was formless, empty, Spirit of God hovering. The Spirit of God hovering over. And the word hovering is like bird imagery, avian imagery, like circling over the deep. So God said, let there be light. And there was light. Now this is something that the ancient readers would have thought, wait a minute, that's not how gods do stuff. Gods fight battles and overcome and conquer, and that's how things get done. Not in the Hebrew scriptures. The Hebrew God is a God who speaks, and through his word, creation comes into being. So you have Spirit hovering over the waters, and through that Spirit hovering over the waters, now you have God giving his word and things starting to happen. Spirit and Logos, Spirit and Word. This is all important for way, way, way later in the New Testament when we finally realize who Spirit and Word are and what's going on there. But God saw the light. So the first thing created, let there be light. God saw the light, it was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day. Do you see that? The light is what God called Yom, day. And the darkness he called night. There was evening and there was morning the first day. So, right here in this verse, you have that word Yom used in two different meanings. You have it meaning daylight, and then there was evening, there was morning. the first day. So already you should be realizing, okay, a literalistic pressing of the word day to mean a 24-hour solar day can't bear with the text itself. It's something else is going on here. And so we'll see it as we go along, but it's good to note. So this first day, and I've given you on page 28, you can fill these in if you want to. The first yom, the first day, what God creates or manipulates or regulates is light and dark, day and night. That's what we have on the first yom. Then God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. There was evening and there was morning, the second day. So now on day 2, what God does is he separates the waters from the sky. And it talks about there's waters, there's this expanse. And the word that's used, rachiach, is this word that means dome. I mean, literally it means dome. But it also means the shape of like shields, vaults, vaulted ceilings. It's the common ancient Near East word for how the other ancient cultures viewed creation, which was this dome above the firmament of the earth, resting on the pillars and all this stuff. Genesis is using this imagery that was already familiar with people of that time. But doing that, it's going to then use their language to point them towards this God of the Hebrews. In other words, it's going to be what C.S. Lewis called a true myth. It's going to take the concept and the categories of the ancient Near East myths, and it's going to give the true version, or the version from which they've all strayed over the centuries as humans spread out and began to follow other gods, create gods of their own making, worship aspects of creation. And so what we have in Genesis then is we're kind of getting, at least if we believe the text, the true version, the real version of the ancient cosmology myth. And so God creates in the second yom, he separates waters above and waters below this thing called the sky. Now, here's where we have to start asking questions. What does it mean, waters above and waters below? Some interpreters will take it and say, well, there used to be a cosmic ocean that surrounded the earth, and that's what later flooded the world, and that's what, in the time of Noah, and then now it's gone because it either evaporated out in space or God, whatever. It's just there used to be an ocean, but now there's not. Okay, well, theoretically, that's maybe possible. Who knows? But in the minds of the first audience, they thought pretty phenomenologically. And phenomenologically, what I mean by that is you describe things how it appears, not necessarily how it actually is. We do it every day. We're even in an advanced scientific society, which is what we are, we use phenomenological language all the time. You pick up the newspaper, every morning you're going to read what time the sun rises. It'll say it, sunrise, 6:37 this morning, whatever. Well, we know the sun doesn't rise, hopefully. Hopefully we know this. I don't want to take you for granted. There's flat earth people out there. Not in here maybe, but out there in the world. Hopefully we know that, yes, the sun doesn't rise. It's there, and the earth is spinning in relation to it. So from our point of view, it looks like the sun is rising, but in reality, but it's just easy in English to say sunrise. Whoa, what a beautiful sunset. Or, oh, the sun's setting outside. We know the sun is not moving. We're moving in relation to it, rather. But that's just how we say that thing. So what does that have to do? Well, ancient Hebrew worked that way as well. They described things how it appeared, just like we do today. And so waters above and waters below is a perfectly fine way of describing what we today might call the water cycle, or condensation, evaporation, rainfall, all that stuff. Think of the ancient Near East shepherd, nomad, whoever reading this or hearing this account around the campfire. They know there's water on the earth because they feed their animals and irrigate their crops with it. And they know that there's water that falls down from up there because that's how their crops grow. They know what rain is. So the perfectly fine way to describe, and oh, guess what? What color is that big thing above us? It's blue. You look up, the sky is blue. So saying water's above and water's below is a pretty good way, I would say, to describe what we today with climate science and geology and all of that stuff, meteorology, what we would call this cycle of evaporation, condensation, rainfall, whatever. The point is that we need to see or hear what they would have heard, and that's kind of what they would have heard, is there's water up there and it falls on us, we know that, and there's water down here because we drink it and we bathe in it, and then there's something between, because I reach up and I can't grab that ocean. You know, I don't grab water when I jump high, when I climb a mountain, when I climb a tower. There's still this thing, no matter where I go, and the stars that move across it, as we'll see, it's like they're moving across a dome. That's why when you go to planetariums today, they're shaped like domes, and they project the stars and all that really cool stuff. So this is what we have so far. Day 1, light and dark. Day 2, water and sky, being separated, being formed, and then being separated. So God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds. And it was so. So now on this day, it was so. The land produced vegetation, specifically plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, the third day. So now the separation becomes between the waters below, so we've moved from the big realm down to the surface, and on the surface God separates the waters from this thing called land. Interestingly enough, that word land, eretz or aretz, means earth as well. So in the Bible, when you read the word earth, you can easily read that as a land because it's the same thought concept. This is before the idea of a globe in space was popular in thinking. It's just the land. There's the sea, there's the land. Those are the two elements of the surface of this thing that we live on. And so God's, one, creating and separating, so he brings the land out of what was previously there. And then he says, let the land bring forth vegetation. And then specifically gives these specific types of vegetation, seed bearing. Why is that important? Well, the first readers and hearers of this were agricultural people. They were planters, they were farmers, they relied on seed bearing plants. They ate fruit from trees that bore seed. These are the things that they knew. Is this talking about moss? Is this talking about algae? Is this talking about sequoia or redwoods in California? No, it's not talking about any of that stuff. Why? Because none of that has any relevance to the ancient Hebrews. It's talking about the things that they know. That's what they would have heard. That's what they would have known. Yeah, of course we know. Of course, trees would bear seed. We plant those seeds and more trees grow. We eat the fruit off of those trees. That's how we feed our animals and ourselves. I mean, these are the things that they know. They know sea, they know land. So again, it's speaking to their context, fitting their world together. Interestingly, God says, let the land bring forth vegetation. How many of you have ever thought about that? That on this day when God creates the land and vegetation, God doesn't create the vegetation. God makes the land create the vegetation. Creation itself is given this ability to bring forth life from itself. That's part of God's design. Now, that has to play into later discussions. Once we get all this and we go, okay, so now what does this do with evolution, life's development, all that kind of stuff? Well, these are the kind of things that we have to take notice. It's not like God's the big wizard that says, all right, shrubbery, bam, apple tree, bam, bushes, bam, right? He's not just making these things. That's not how God does it in this section. It's the separation, speaking, and then the land brings forth. There's the ability within creation to recreate. And in that way, creation reflects the Creator. So that will have to play into whatever your view ends up being about how life developed on Earth scientifically.